imposing penalties to get parents to immunise their children. Now Australian families could lose over $2,000 for each child if they don't. Is this the right approach? Are the risks of vaccination small compared with the health risks associated with the diseases they're intended to prevent? This is Inside Story. Hello again, welcome to the programme. I'm James Bayes. It was over 200 years ago that Edward Jenner, the pioneer of the smallpox vaccination, was able to protect a man from the dreaded disease smallpox through vaccination. Since that time, through mass immunisation efforts, smallpox has been eradicated from the planet. Vaccinations have eliminated polio from much of the world and controlled many diseases that once maimed or killed in large numbers. However, in recent years, a growing number of parents have been expressing concern about immunisation. Some are refusing to vaccinate their children because of what they've heard or read. Medical experts across the world say all their research shows there's no evidence of a link with conditions like autism and sudden infant death syndrome. In Australia, the government has decided to take increased action. Already there's a penalty for not vaccinating your children. You lose out on tax benefits. Under the new rules, some families could lose the equivalent of over $2,000 for each child not fully immunised. From Sydney, Andrew Thomas has our report.
Along with spiders, bedtime and broccoli, getting vaccinated is something most children the world over hate. But in Australia, being vaccinated is hard to avoid.
For me, having an immunisation done is about protecting his health. If he's going to sort of play groups and, you know, the other mothers want to make sure that they're immunised as well, so...
But should parents have an extra financial incentive? The Australian government wants to increase levels of immunisation from an already high 90%. It plans to withhold over $2,000 in benefits from parents who don't take their children for 6 blocks of jabs over 4 years to protect against 12 diseases. It's controversial. Although the government says it's targeting those parents too busy or forgetful to get vaccinations done, some question the prevailing policy and don't like money coming into the equation.
If somebody's saying, oh, I'll pay you a couple of $1,000s to make a decision, you actually aren't making an informed decision based just on the science.
Neither Saffron nor Quincy have had any medical injections because of their parents' concerns over side effects. Australian parents can register as conscientious objectors and still get benefits, but that involves complicated forms, so all the assumptions are in favour of vaccination.
The benefits of vaccination for individual children and for the population far outweigh any risks.
Every parent wants to do the best by their child. Governments have a duty to do what they think is best for the population as a whole. For some, cash incentives are a good way to bring those two things together. For others, the need for bribes is proof the two are fundamentally opposed. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Sydney.
So, should the risks of vaccinations discourage parents from immunising their children? To answer these questions, we're joined by our guest today. In Bristol in the UK, we have Professor Adam Finn. He's head of the academic unit of child health at Bristol Medical School and an honorary consultant in paediatric infectious diseases and immunology at the Bristol Royal Hospital for Children's, and he heads the Bristol Children's Vaccine Centre. Also in London, we have Brian Deer, an investigative journalist who's reported on the controversy surrounding the MMR vaccine in the UK. Can I start in Bristol with you, Professor Finn, to start our discussion? I think the most important thing to discuss first is what these vaccines are for. We all know as kids that we get vaccinations. I think some 40 years ago I was given vaccinations as a baby. But just go through the basics with us. What are we vaccinating children against, and exactly what are those diseases, and what are the eventual effects of those diseases?
Well, there's quite a long list, as a matter of fact, and the list has doubled in size since when I qualified as a doctor in the mid-1980s. The earlier members of the list are diseases which killed very large numbers of children prior to the middle of the 20th century. Diseases like diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, and polio. But we've added quite substantially to that list in more recent years, including causes of meningitis, which is a rarer, although serious and often fatal disease. And now we're beginning to see the arrival of a new generation of vaccines against common but less serious diseases, and also against some infections that cause rare diseases, including forms of cancer. So it's really quite a long list, more than a dozen diseases now being protected against.
Brian, in London, we hear about this lengthening list of diseases, but also in recent years, the public seem to be getting more and more worried about these vaccinations. Do they have a right to worry?
Well, I've spent something like 8 years investigating possible risks of vaccines, not only the MMR vaccine, but also the diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis triple vaccine. And I can tell you, as a journalist, nothing would make me, in a sense, happier than to be able to report to you that I had discovered that vaccines were associated with serious injuries to children or the public generally.
Because it would be a great story.
It would be a great
It
would be a great story. It would be a great story, and journalists have for years gone after that story, and sometimes they've formed alliances with various members of the public to try and demonstrate that story. But you know, that story has just not turned out to be correct. We know that, I'm sure Professor Finn can tell you much more clearly than I can, that all drugs, all medicines are associated with side effects in some patients to some extent. But the idea that there are serious risks associated with vaccines that should concern parents when they give them to their children or when they go to the doctors and have vaccines themselves simply hasn't been borne out by the facts, no matter how hard people have tried to make that story stand up.
You say that, but we have to remind everyone, and I know he was discredited back in 1998, that article in the Lancet, Mr. Andrew Wakefield, he was a doctor at the time. Just remind people of that case, please, Brian, because I know you were involved in the reporting of it and in uncovering wrongdoing.
Well, yes, I mean, that really is the classic example of people who want to create concern about vaccinations. Everybody has vaccines. There are all kinds of problems which occur in childhood, and people have tried to associate one with the other. And the story of Andrew Wakefield was of a doctor who led the world to believe that he'd shown an association between the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, which is 3 vaccines given in one in Western countries to almost all children, and increasingly around the world to almost all children receive this vaccine. He tried to show that it was associated with autism, a serious disorder quite often where children appear to be developing normally and then start to lose skills, start to lose language. And he tried to show that there was an association between the two. And what I was able to do was to demonstrate that he'd been hired to make this allegation by lawyers who were trying to get lawsuits going over vaccines. And really, when one took apart his allegations, one found there was absolutely nothing there. It was a complete false alarm and a great tragedy, I think, because certainly in advanced Western countries such as the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, in these countries, there was a tremendous public concern, tremendous anxiety for parents. And I think some people have now tried to export that to the rest of the world. And we have the benefit now of knowing that what Andrew Wakefield said was false.
Professor Finn, that was some 14 years ago. Do you think it's still having an effect on the public?
It's funny you should ask that question because just last night I was actually being interviewed by the BBC here in Bristol because we're seeing an increased number of cases of measles in this area of the country, but actually in a number of areas around Europe. And this is in fact the legacy of that vaccine scare. There are many children scattered through the age groups in our society who've not received the necessary 2 doses of MMR, and enough of them are susceptible to measles that we're now seeing transmission of the infection. So although immunisation rates have recovered to a large extent, we're left with this legacy of a significant number of children who are susceptible.
Why do you think you're not getting the message across, Professor? When I went on Google earlier on, I put in the words vaccination and autism, and 2 million hits came up.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think there are a number of reasons why it's so easy to amplify these false allegations about vaccines. The first is that vaccines are a victim of their own success. The diseases that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion have for the most part disappeared, and measles is very much an exception to that rule. So these are diseases that people no longer fear because they don't see them. They don't appear to pose a risk. And so in that context, it's very much easier to get focused on apparent side effects and to forget about the real tangible benefit that exists from actually receiving the vaccines.
Brian, why do you think the message is not getting across?
Well, I think in part you kind of answered your own question when you said you were able to go into Google and get 2 million hits by putting in MMR and autism. The nature of media is changing very dramatically. When I first started looking at this issue was with the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine, where there was a tremendous alarm about that in the 1970s and 1980s in some of the Western countries. In those days, big media, you know, the British Broadcasting Corporation and the BBC World Service Radio and major newspapers, the New York Times, was able to say, well, there's a concern over this. Several years later, they say, no, we were wrong, it's all a mistake, there's not a problem. Today, people are able all over the world to go into websites being put up by all kinds of strange people calling themselves all kinds of strange things. You know, you and I could get together and start ourselves a website calling ourselves the International Vaccine Advisory Service if we wanted, if there isn't one already, and there probably is. And any number of people would be able to find that information, and some of them believe it. So we're seeing a dramatic change in the nature of media, and that makes the whole question of how one educates on questions of public health, and vaccines is the preeminent issue, I think, in public health, apart from safe water supply. People are able to get information from all kinds of strange sources, and they're not sure who is going to advise them what the truth is.
Well, we've certainly been looking on the web today, and I was looking on the website of one reputable source, the CDC, the US Centre for Diseases Control and Prevention. It's published what it says are the 6 common misconceptions which concern parents to question the wisdom of vaccinating their children. Let's run through those misconceptions. Number 1 is that diseases had already begun to disappear before vaccines were introduced because of better hygiene and sanitation. The second misconception or myth, the majority of people getting the disease have already been fully immunised. Then there's the misconception that there are many case reports of harmful side effects from vaccines, including deaths. This proves that vaccines are not safe. There's also the misconception that vaccines cause many harmful side effects, illnesses and even death, not to mention possible long-term effects we don't even know about. And another myth, they say, is that vaccine-preventable diseases have already virtually eliminated diseases from many countries, so there's no need for children in those countries to be vaccinated. And finally, they say this myth, giving a child multiple vaccinations for different diseases at the same time increases the harmful side effects and can overload the immune system. Professor, that last one, the idea of a sort of toxic cocktail, that seems to be out there everywhere on the internet.
Yes, it's an idea that's very easy to get hold of, and it sort of feels like it ought to be true, which makes it a very pervasive one. It's made even more confusing by the fact that it is true to say that if you combine vaccines together, they do sometimes interfere with the effectiveness of each other. So you have to be very careful about how you formulate combined vaccines, and that's the way that we very often give vaccines to children, to save them from being stuck with needles multiple times. But that, although it sounds like a similar thing, is actually quite a different thing from saying that by giving the vaccines you're somehow injuring the child in a non-specific way or making them more susceptible to other infections. And if anything, in fact, the opposite appears to be true. So that if you immunise children against measles, not only do they not get measles, but their overall mortality rate from other causes appears to go down. So although that seems like a very compelling idea, it's not really supported by the evidence.
Isn't it hard, though, for you, Professor, to deal with some of this anecdotal evidence that's out there on the internet? I'm quoting now from something that calls itself the Think Twice Institute. A quote here, these are their adverse reaction reports. My beautiful 4-year-old grandson is not talking and showing signs of autism. He was a vibrant, healthy baby boy until his baby shots at the age of 14 months. How do you combat that sort of testimony?
It's very difficult, and in fact, if you think about it for a moment, if you were a parent, or indeed if I were a parent whose child fell very seriously ill shortly after having received a vaccine without any other obvious explanation, it would be extremely difficult to avoid jumping to the conclusion that the vaccine was somehow involved. We are, after all, a narrative species. We understand the world in terms of stories, and when something like that happens to you, you can easily understand how that becomes very convincing. So it is a difficult thing to combat, given that you're going to be giving vaccines to virtually all children, and at some point, sooner or later, inevitably, one or other of those children is going to fall sick for some other reason, but at the same time as having received the vaccine. So this is not easy, and it's something we should expect and anticipate. So I think your question is a very valid one, and we do now need to think much harder about how we effectively communicate the benefits of vaccines. Brian earlier on pointed out that it really ranks up there with clean water as being one of the most effective public health interventions ever invented. We as a species, we're better off as a result of vaccines by a much greater extent than all of the rest of modern medicine put together. But we don't really celebrate the fact. We don't really very often mention it. In fact, we just forget about it, really. So that when we hear about vaccines, instead of hearing about the remarkable achievements, we just tend to hear about the imagined dangers of using them.
Brian, you're an expert in telling stories, people's stories. You hear those sort of stories. To counter them, do the doctors, do the medical profession, do they need to tell their stories in a more compelling way?
Yes, I think they do. And one of the stories which I could tell as a journalist is I can assure you that if I was to run a story in the Sunday Times of London saying that, Christian baptism was associated with autism, and perhaps it's something to do with the marble used in the churches. We don't know, but Professor so-and-so says he thinks it's a possibility. If I was to run that story, I can assure you there would be people all over the world parents who would ransack their children's records, and they'd say, oh yes, we took our child to be vaccinated, to be baptised in a Christian church, and 4 days later he started to show symptoms of autism. It's the kind of people we are. I mean, if you were to say, if you were to try and associate these disorders with perhaps a trip to the zoo, you would find that enormous numbers of children had been taken to the zoo shortly before they showed the first signs of a problem. So there are ways in which I think people can come back and answer some of these questions with the kind of stories which parallel the misinformation which is being put out.
Professor Finn, isn't one of the problems that the onset of autism, the timing of that, it seems in most cases, comes at the same sort of time that children are vaccinated?
Yes, absolutely. It is going to be a temporal thing. Although once a story takes hold, of course, it doesn't have to happen straight away for people to associate the two. In fact, another problem relating to a condition like autism is that it isn't a very well defined condition, and it can be quite hard to pin down when the disease began to be manifest. Exactly, it's a progressive thing. There isn't a clear test to label a child, and so it can be very difficult, or conversely it can be very easy to make associations where they don't really exist.
Well, is autism on the rise? Let's just clear that one up. Are rates of autism rising?
Yes, it certainly is. It has been for a number of years, and it seems clear that that rise is not just a matter of more people recognising it and giving it that name. There appears to be a genuine upturn in the number of cases. Excuse me, I've just lost the earpiece.
Okay, I was going to ask you why then, Professor, is it on the rise? And if you can't answer that question, Isn't that the problem?
Yes, I can't answer that question, and it is the problem. And of course, when you have a problem like that, if someone comes up with an explanation, that immediately attracts a lot of attention, particularly if it's something that's potentially easily solved, like not giving measles vaccine. The great tragedy of that particular story is that enormous amounts of effort and research funding were then diverted into proving that measles vaccine was not the cause of autism, which could better have been spent on trying to work out what the causes actually are.
Brian, we have this new development. The Australians for some time have been penalising those that vaccinate their children. They're now increasing those penalties, deducting much more from people's tax benefits. Do you think that will work?
Well, I think attempts from central government to sort of enforce vaccination policies don't really work. Certainly they've not worked in the United Kingdom. In the United States there's a bit more of pressure saying that, in most states saying that children shouldn't be admitted to schools until they're vaccinated. But at the end of the day it's an educational journey that needs to involve people, and at the end of the day I think it's the individual doctor and the individual parent or patient where the real message is put over, and that's where people can get the kind of advice they need, is by talking to their local physicians and local nurses and finding out the answers for themselves there, not going on the internet and Googling up all kinds of strange organisations and people with strange agendas, the nature of which are very often difficult to determine.
Professor Finn, do people, do you think, have the right to choose not to vaccinate their children?
I think it's a really interesting one, this, and I think you can put arguments on both sides of the story. And I'd like first to contradict what Brian just said, because he's not correct in saying that this kind of requirement to immunise in order to receive benefits or to be admitted to school doesn't work. In fact, in Australia, the linking of immunisation to benefits had a very rapid and very clearly demonstrated effect by increasing immunisation rates. So if all you're interested in is whether or not it works, at least in some situations it does work. Now that isn't to say that it's necessarily the right thing to do, and it probably isn't the right thing to do in many situations, in particular in situations where you've already got very good vaccine uptake rates so that you haven't got a problem to fix. But the one point I would make about this is that the efforts to get parents to immunise their children are probably focused more on people who don't have very strong feelings either way than on people who violently object. In most settings where this sort of thing is done, there are get-outs. In one way or another, if people really feel strongly they don't want to have their children immunised, there's a way of getting exemption. And what's being done is in situations where there are relatively low uptake rates, a bit like with laws around using seat belts, that little extra push has the effect of getting people to get their children immunised who don't feel strongly that they do or don't want to, but just need to be kind of encouraged along the way.
Because,
and I think that's the thinking behind it.
Professor, if you don't get your children immunised, it's not only going to affect your children. That's the case, isn't it?
Well, I think that's another very important point, and it's not sufficiently emphasised in the way that we communicate with parents about immunisation. I think parents are told very clearly that if they immunise their children, they're protecting their children against infectious diseases that they might otherwise get. What they're not told enough is that by doing this, they're also protecting other people's children too. And for nearly all the vaccines we use, this is a very important part of the way that the vaccine programme works. By immunising your children, you're not only protecting them from getting sick, but you're preventing them from spreading infections around. And of course, it's not a big step from there to see how in the context of a school or a nursery, you could really quite reasonably say to a parent, is it reasonable for you to bring your child here, potentially infectious, to potentially threaten all these other children whose parents have complied with immunisation policy? So actually there is a bigger picture here, and people ought to have it explained to them that they're really playing part of a bigger game.
OK, well, thank you, Professor. Thank you to both our guests in Bristol, Professor Adam Finn, and in London, Brian Deer. And thank you for joining us on today's edition of Inside Story. We want to know what you thought, and we'd like your ideas of what we should cover next. Just email us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.